A business model for a mature organisation typically has to deal with the transition between existing technology and new technology, new capabilities, whatever. And the STEM modelling software has for a long time had capabilities to support a natural transition as equipment wears out, an accelerated transition if there is an economic advantage you want to get to earlier of the new equipment, and also to model your choices about whether to decommission the old equipment either immediately or later, depending on whatever kind of process delays or other agendas you might have. So STEM has had these capabilities for a long time and has already made it a very powerful platform for making those kinds of models, but if it was good before, now we're going to make it better by adding some capabilities to make it easier to achieve a stated modelling aim, and also to introduce greater flexibility in how such outcomes are achieved. So we'll start off by looking at a simple model just to set the scene. So in the model I have here, I have a service and it has a constant demand of 1,000 rather, and that demand of 1,000 is going to be carried by one of two resources in the function. They both have a capacity of 10 subscribers, which means we will need 100 of them to do it. And if I look at the mapping onto the function, what you'll see is there is a transition which basically says that from year 3 onwards we want any new demand to be carried by the new resource. So if we go over and look at the simple results for a model like that over here, then here's our demand of 1,000, and initially it's carried all by resource 1, and finally it goes to resource 2, but you'll see that it doesn't actually make that transition until year 10, and the reason for that is that the equipment has been given a 10-year lifetime, and even though the preference changes in year 3, actually it's only a preference for any new demand, and because it's static there isn't any new demand, so it will keep using the existing equipment until it wears out, unless you do something to accelerate it. So if we first of all look at how you might accelerate such a transition, we'll switch back to the editor, and where that transition is accelerated is it's actually in the requirement for the resource. So I go here and look at the details. So within this requirement I have some parameters. Originally it was just called a churn proportion. It's now made more explicit under the heading of migration, and there is a new churn mode which I'll explain in a minute. Historically this was interpreted as an instantaneous proportion, which meant that if you set this to, let's say, 0.5, it meant that each period it would churn 50% of the demand. So 50% of the demand would go back to the current mappings to say, where should I go now? And because we're saying that from year 3 it should go to the other one, it means that from year 3 you would expect that to mean we would start moving the demand. And so if I run the model, I'll go through, and what you'll see is now from year 3 onwards it's going to move 50% of the demand and another 50% of the demand, and so on and so forth. So the new resource is installed to take up the unmet demand, and the old resource is then used proportionally less. It's actually the other way around, but really it's that the other resource says I'm going to push my demand back, and STEM says okay, I'm going to put that rebalanced demand onto the other resource, which then takes over. And you can imagine if you make this chart a stacked chart, then these numbers would still add up to 1,000. In this chart down here, which is showing it's just for resource 1, it's showing the used units compared to the installed units. What you'll see is that because it has a lifetime of 10, it still stays in the business up until year 10 as it did before. And so you'll then say, well, what do we actually want to do about decommissioning that equipment? Do we want to just not decommission it at all and leave it there all along, or do we want to choose to get rid of it? So what's often done in business cases for simplicity is to say, yes, we want to not only move the demand, but we want to get rid of the old equipment straight away. And to do that, you go to the old resource, you go advanced, and then other details. And then under redundant units, again, it used to be just a decommissioning proportion, and it was interpreted as an instantaneous proportion, and the most common thing to do was to set this to 1, and that would mean decommission everything that you can, i.e. everything that's slack we'll get rid of. And you run it again like that, it'll go through, and what you'd see is that now, whereas we had all those installed units hanging around, we're actually getting rid of them just as fast as they cease to be used, and that's often the simplest thing to do. You could also choose to do it with a proportion, so if I put a 0.5 there, then what it would mean is that as they become free, then we'll start getting rid of some of them, but it's hard to see really why you would do that. More likely you might choose to do it with a delay, so what you could do is you could have something like it being 1 but only 1 after a certain time, so it could be that you'd go and make this into an interpolated series, and you could do something like, say, up to year 5 have it as 0, meaning don't decommission, and then from year 6 onwards you may set it to 1, and if I run it like that, then what you'll see happen is basically we hang on to them for a few years, and then from year 6 onwards then we're going to say, okay, actually now we're always going to get rid of them straight away. So in a nutshell, those are the two devices in STEM which allow you to control how fast you would make such a transition if you want to do it ahead of time, and then what to do with the remaining equipment of the old style. So that's effectively the starting point, and before we look at the new and clever things you can do in STEM 7.5, the first thing we need to do is actually look at a potential issue that was always there in 7.4 if you looked at it hard enough. And in order to illustrate this, for now I'm going to make the decommissioning simpler just so we don't get confused by the results, and so I'm going to put the decommissioning back to being just a constant 1. So I'll split this back to being a constant 1, and that means they'll go away straight away, so the graph just goes back to like this. And at the moment the results we're looking at are just annual, so we're doing 50% this year, 50% this year, and so on. Now this is sort of an accident, but the way it had always been designed was it was said it's 50% in the period when you do the calculation, and the trouble with that is that if you run your model in quarters, then it's going to say, actually I'm going to do 50% in each quarter. Maybe not so good. So let's see what happens. So if I go to the run period, and if I choose to run the whole model in quarters, like this, and if I just run the working model, let's just specifically say let's just run the working model, then what you'll see is, well, actually it's now going to 50% really quickly, and then doing another 50%, and actually it's nearly all over in the first year. So it's a bit not very good, because actually what you're seeing is that you now get different results if you run in quarters compared to running in years, and obviously if you run in months as well, then you can guess it's probably going to get even worse. If I put this to 40 and run it again, then it goes really quickly. So that's not very good. So actually the first thing we've added in STEM 7.5 is a choice over the interpretation of this proportion. And if I go back to the requirement, you'll see that this churn mode, which essentially is a new input, where it says instantaneous proportion, I had set that up just to essentially to show how it used to work. And actually there are now several options in here, and instantaneous proportion is not the default. It's actually what will only be set when you load an old model, just to keep the results the same as they used to be. The new default is actually going to be annual proportion, and what that means is it will scale this actually with a suitable power law, so that it will give you 50% over a year. But if you're doing it in quarter of a year, it'll give you the quarter root of 50%, whatever that means. The idea being that if you then do it 4 times, you'll get back to the number you first thought of. So it's not the quarter root of half, it's actually, well, it is a half, but if you were doing, say, 25%, it would be the quarter root of 3/4, because it's actually 3/4 to the power 4 that you're left with. Anyway, you get the general idea. So now, if I run the model, bingo, we're back to it being 50% over the year as a whole, even though we're running in months. And it now has the nice behaviour, which is that these are the results you get running in months. And if I switch back to the editor, go back to the run period, and let's turn off the month first of all, run it again, and now it's in quarters, but it looks kind of the same. And we go back and we turn off the quarters, Right again, and now behold, it still looks the same. So the first thing we've done, just to go back to the edge to look at it more closely, the first thing we've done is we've added this churn mode, and by default it will be annual proportion. So that means in a new model, when you say 50%, it will actually interpret it as maybe what it should have always done, which is to say it will say this is the amount it will do each year, and it will then scale it appropriately if you are in different periods. As I say, there is an instantaneous proportion which we've left at the end, which is a way to get the results you would have got historically, and that will be set when you upgrade a model created with a version of STEM prior to 7.5.